Welcome to Houston Water's video that will provide a summary of process and epidemiology sampling at our 39 wastewater treatment plants. This video will provide a summary of these 6 topics, starting with a brief introduction to the City of Houston, a summary of Houston Water's wastewater system, a summary of Houston Water's process control epidemiology sampling program, example sample collection efforts at Houston's Intercontinental Airport wastewater treatment plant, a summary of sample handling activities, and notes of issues that are unique to Houston but might also be of interest to other water utilities. We'll start with a brief summary of Houston.
The City of Houston is located in southeast Texas. This city has grown at a rapid pace, especially since the 1960s. Houston is currently the 4th largest city in the United States, with a 2020 city population of over 2,300,000 and a metro area population of over 4,700,000. The City of Houston occupies almost 670 square miles, which would fit the land area of several large U.S. cities. Houston is half the size of the state of Rhode Island.
Now let's take a brief look at Houston's wastewater system.
Due to the flat topography in this region of Texas and rapid growth, Houston's wastewater system has many facilities. Houston's wastewater system has 39 wastewater treatment plants and 2 wet weather facilities. It has over 380 lift stations and 325 miles of force mains. This length of force mains is about the distance between Houston and Wichita Falls, Texas to the northwest. Houston's wastewater system also includes almost 130,000 manholes. It has approximately 6,200 miles of collection lines, or about the distance of 2 round trips from Houston to Los Angeles. Each of Houston's plant service areas are of varying size and customer type, with widely varying loading patterns.
Now that you have seen how big Houston is, let's look at Houston's plant process control and epidemiology sampling program.
For several decades, Houston Water has been monitoring the actual loading to all of its 5 major wastewater treatment plants and most of its satellite plants. A total of 29 plant loading patterns have been monitored 5 days each week. Pre-pandemic, Houston's Wastewater Laboratory Group has been collecting and analyzing these samples only for plant operations use. With coordination between Houston Water, the city's health department, and local universities, process control sampling was expanded to include all 39 plants in order to help with pandemic monitoring needs. Houston uses 120-volt, AC-powered, refrigerated, all-weather, automatic samplers to collect a 24-hour, time-weighted composite sample at each of its plant's headworks process units. Samples are collected either up or downstream of the headworks screens. A programmed sample volume is collected each hour. The city is currently using Hawk's AS950 permanent samplers and ISCO's Avalanche portable samplers. If pandemic-type sampling efforts continue, permanent samples will eventually be installed at all 39 plants. The samplers are provided with electric power via GFCI outlets and extension cords. This allows sampler relocation or changeout by non-electricians. The permanent sampler components include a controller to program settings such as sample volume, sample frequency, and pump start-stop times. The sampler uses a peristaltic pump with silicone tubing and a stainless steel strainer to fill the sample container. A locking refrigerated cabinet includes a 5-gallon sample container and feed tubing. The sample refrigeration system uses a thermostat to keep the sample water at a constant temperature of 4 degrees Celsius. The sampler enclosures are made of polyethylene. These samplers weigh approximately 150 pounds. Monday through Friday of each week, plant process control influence samples are collected, analyzed, entered into our HawkWIMS database, and made available to city plant operations and process engineering personnel. An example of some of the influent parameters are shown here. The samples collected each Tuesday are split and sent out for epidemiology analysis by the city's health department and university labs. Houston's wastewater laboratory is located on the west central side of the city, near Interstate 10 and Beltway 8. All process control samples are received at this facility, checked in, stored, and routed to the proper internal lab for process control analyses. Each Tuesday, samples are picked up by the health department and university personnel for off-site analysis. Plant sample collection routes are started early each weekday morning and are typically completed before noon each day. Each route starts and ends at the wastewater lab facilities. Process control sample routes have been established with plant location and layout, traffic patterns, route distance, and other factors in mind. Each route is run by a single sampler driver operating from one fully equipped city vehicle. For the week shown in this example route schedule, there were between 3 and 5 sample routes each day. The routes were labeled A through E, and the plants on each route are noted. There are between 2 and 8 plants per route for this example. Although routes start early in the morning, oftentimes there are unexpected delays that must be anticipated. As a result, route times vary, with samples returning to the lab facility at varying times of the day. Experienced drivers that know their sample routes can recognize traffic patterns and avoid delays. Communications between drivers and use of Houston's TranStar traffic monitoring app also helps to maintain traffic route times.
In order to provide more details of how the plant process samples are collected, we will show how samples are collected at the city's Intercontinental Airport wastewater treatment plant.
The Intercontinental plant is located in North Houston, adjacent to the city's Intercontinental Airport. This plant is a conventional activated sludge plant that includes a headworks process unit that receives influent flow from both on-site and off-site lift stations. Upon arrival at each plant, the driver first checks in at the plant operations building. This allows the operator to know who's on the plant grounds, as well as to keep an eye out for any safety issues that might arise. It also allows the sampler and plant operators to discuss any plant issues that may have arisen during sample collection and that may arise during sample retrieval. At the Intercontinental plant, the influence sampler is located just upstream of the multi-rate mechanical bar screens. A screened, weighted tube draws water samples from the headworks channel. The tube is positioned such that it remains submerged at all times, even when the lift station pumps are off. The tube is also located to minimize debris buildup. The Intercontinental plant sampler layout is an example of how samplers are installed at grade and draw water samples from an elevated headworks. The Intercontinental sampler's main pump was bypassed in order to allow elevated handrail installation of a remote pump. The remote pump was purchased from the sampler manufacturer. The existing sampler pump was bypassed, and the remote pump was field wired to the sampler controls. A goal of remote pump mounting includes eliminating issues with water in the sampler tubing turning stagnant between sample draws. When the driver arrives at the plant headworks, he goes to the sampler with sample containers in hand. Pre-labeled and clean sample containers are placed adjacent to the sampler. Initially, the driver records key sample collection information from the sampler controller. This information will later be logged on sampling forms. Next, the sampler cabinet is unlocked and opened. The temperature of a separate small water sample in the cabinet is checked to verify that the sampler water is currently at 4 degrees Celsius. This is what the small water sample temperature bottle looks like. The temperature is checked with a portable thermometer. The sampler pump tubing is removed from the sampler container. The sample container is removed from the sampler cabinet and shaken to stir the sample. Sample bottle lids are removed and the sample is poured into each of the required sample containers. Excess sample water is poured into the plant return drainage system. Next, the sampler container lid is reattached and the sampler pump tubing is run through the top of this lid. The sampler container is returned to the sampler cabinet. The sampler cabinet door is closed and locked. Next, the sampler log is completed. The information contained in this log includes sample date and time, sample water temperature, sample volume, and the driver's signature. The collected sample bottles are brought to the sample vehicle and immediately placed on ice to preserve these samples. Once the samples have been stored on ice, the driver fills out the sample-specific chain of custody form. This form tracks the samples from collection to analyses. An example wastewater operations chain of custody form is shown here.
Next, we will show what happens to the samples once they are collected.
As each sampling route is completed, the driver returns to the wastewater operations lab facilities to unload their samples. The driver brings their samples to the loading dock at the lab facility. The samples are brought into the lab facilities by each driver. The driver removes the samples from the ice chest. The driver checks and records the delivered sample temperatures. As the other samples arrive at the lab facilities, they are sorted by analyses type. The delivered samples are transferred to refrigerated storage prior to analyses. Epidemiology samples are refrigerator stored until the City Health Department and universities pick up these samples the same afternoon. Lab personnel take ownership of the delivered samples. This transfer is documented on each route's chain of custody. A recently executed chain of custody is shown here. The lab also maintains a specific check-in list for the collected plant epidemiology samples. A recently executed epidemiology sample check-in list is shown here.
Finally, we will identify plant sample collection issues that are unique to Houston, but likely of interest to other water utilities.
This is a list of issues that might be unique to Houston, but are likely of interest to other water utilities. First, Houston's health department and local universities normalized epidemiology sample results using plant effluent flow data. Wastewater operations sends detailed flow data from its plant SCADA system to the health department on a weekly basis. Plant loading during rain events is diluted by the infiltration and inflow that most of Houston's plant service areas experience. Therefore, epidemiology sampling events are suspended or adjusted when the city makes a decision that plant loading is being impacted by wet weather flows. The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality has developed general guidance for wastewater treatment plant process control sampling and testing. While not a regulatory requirement, this guidance is intended to guide operators in the effective operation of their plants. Plant service areas were engineered as the City of Houston rapidly grew. These service areas have no link to U.S. postal zip code areas by which most of the health department data is grouped. Sampler maintenance tasks such as replacing worn tubing and strainers, replacing desiccant, repairing the sampler refrigeration system, and other tasks was not discussed in this video. However, wastewater operations has a team of employees that work with the sampler manufacturers to maintain the samplers. Houston Water has been asked to ship plant process control samples via overnight carriers to university, lab companies, and equipment manufacturers. Such packages are labeled UN 3373 and have to be dropped off at the carrier's main shipping centers versus local drop-off locations.
So now you know a little about the large city of Houston, how wastewater is controlled through Houston's vast flat lands, and how samples are taken throughout the city to be analyzed in the lab.